And I am going to introduce Dr. Michaela Null now. She completed her undergraduate studies at Wright State and spent a year as an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer at TOP, the other place. It's now called Homeful. It's a daytime homeless shelter in Dayton. Before getting her PhD in sociology and women's studies from Purdue University in 2012, she has taught classes in sociology and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Fond du Lac, Sinclair, Wright State, and Wittenberg University. And she is a member of Surge Ohio, that's Showing Up for Racial Justice. And she currently works as a makerspace specialist. So please help me welcome Dr. Michaela Null. And I'm going to turn it over to her now and make sure she can share her screen.
I believe that I can.
Okay.
All right. How is that?
Yep, that looks good.
All right. Let's see. Okay, so welcome to Beyond Colorblindness. As Elizabeth said, there was a previous session and there will be 2 more next year. They're designed to be independent of one another, but if you were in any of the other sessions, they will also build upon one another. I think that talking about colorblindness is a really important topic because for a long time, that was the prevailing ethos around what it meant to be anti-racist. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I think it was really ingrained into several generations to not see color, to be color neutral, race neutral. And I've had a lot of discussions with people about why that might not be the best thing, why that might not actually properly and systemically counter racism in our culture. So first, I want to talk about modern conceptions of racism, because if we're going to talk about anti-racism, we need to talk about what our ideas of racism are. So what we have thought of in the past of racism is a very overt type of racism. So what do people think of when they think of racism? They think of hate groups, the Ku Klux Klan, lynchings, they think of segregation in the Jim Crow era, all of which is racism. But we have moved on in some ways to new forms of racism. So in terms of what we deal with in our society, there is absolutely 100% still overt forms of racism, still people who believe very white supremacist beliefs. They believe in lots of, division between races and all sorts of things. But we also have forms of racism or forms of new racism, which are either more covert, meaning people don't want to be open about their racism, but they're racist behind closed doors. Or people don't necessarily think of themselves as racist, but there are still racist things that are existing. Whether that is in our own minds, unwittingly, or whether that's in the systems that we live within. So historically, when we think of racist, we think of this very severe idea of what a racist is. And that's, I think one of the issues, especially now, is that white people are taught to really distance themselves from that. But that actually doesn't necessarily help if the result is still the same, right? So we can behave in ways that reinforce racism without holding racist beliefs. So people historically think about racism in this very severe way, but modern conceptions of racism are sort of more broad and nuanced. What do people think of when they think of racists? Like I said, sort of the same thing. And people think about who is a racist, and they think, not me. And no one that I know of wants to be called a racist, but regardless of whether you identify as a racist or whether you think you have racist beliefs, we're still living in a system that is built upon racism and perpetuates it. So that's kind of what we're going to be digging into today. So anti-racism. So if these are ideas of racism, then what is anti-racism? So historically, if we look, and I'm being very US centric here, we had a whole system of slavery, and one of the first anti-racist movements in the United States was for abolition. So the abolition of slavery, it did not legislate equality. It was not about races being equal. It was just about, let's not have one group of people primarily enslaved, right? So the abolition of slavery. So that bar for anti-racism is pretty low, right? And then, so we get that, and later you get voting rights, both in the 1800s, but through the mid 1900s, right? And we're still dealing with voting rights issues in our country. But then we add voting rights. So to make things more equal, we give African Americans, non-whites, the right to vote. And then we give them the actual, ideally, we take down the barriers to voting. So there's a huge gap there between voting rights, like legislated, and people actually being able to execute votes, and go in and vote and have their vote counted. Then we move on to anti-discrimination in general. So anti-discrimination in the workplace, we developed things, systems and structures within our government, within our workplaces, and we legislated against discrimination in various ways, in schools, in workplaces, etc. So that was sort of the next bastion of anti-racism. But again, it's great to not discriminate against people, but just eliminating like the current anti-discrimination did not undo all of the past stuff that had happened and had built up to the current society we were in. But then we came in this period where people really emphasized colorblindness. Everybody's human, everybody's equal, which isn't inherently a bad thing to believe. In fact, that's why a lot of people believed it, because they thought, well, this is what it means to be anti-racist, is to not see color, not judge people based on color, and encourage other people not to see color. Later on, we add affirmative action. So affirmative action is distinctly different because it is using race as part of a judgment system, right? Allocating resources and whatnot. And the distinction between those two we'll come back to later. But colorblindness doesn't necessarily make up for that past stuff either, right? And what we have today is more of a focus on racial justice. So like I said, we're going to come back to that. So what is colorblind ideology? So in literature, in academia, you'll hear it referred to as colorblind ideology. It's a particular way of understanding race and thinking that and anti-racism. But there are some issues with it. So it defines the problem as treating people differently based on the color of their skin. And you might read that and think, well, that's what racism is. So what's the problem? And if you were in my last session, then you'll hopefully know the answer to that. But it is a very narrow scope of what racism consists of, right? So it's a narrow definition of what the problem is. It defines the solution as not seeing or acknowledging skin color or other traits of race in order to eliminate that differential treatment. So, okay, the problem is differential treatment. If we just don't see race, then that differential treatment no longer exists, right? Which on its face, again, sounds like, fairly logical. But with this narrow understanding of racism, that problem solution duality is really limited. It focuses on individuals only, right? So it focuses on what individuals believe and how they behave. And so the focus for change is to change that, to change what people believe and how they behave based on color. And the way to do that is to eliminate seeing color. It's also really ahistorical. So it doesn't acknowledge the history, right? Because if you're not going to see color, then it's hard to look back and really fully acknowledge the ways that race has influenced and built our history over time. So our working understanding of racism for this session is much broader than that. In fact, it's obviously individuals, their beliefs and behaviors influence and are part of the building blocks of racism and white supremacy. But that is not it. Racism, as we define it, is systemic. And what I mean by that, you might hear words like structural, institutional. In the article that I gave Elizabeth a link for, and that's in the end of this presentation, there will be a whole section on institutional racism and ideas of racism as a system, not just as a set of beliefs. So it broadens this scope of racism to include our structures, to include the way we do things, to include our culture. And it also is cognizant of the ways in which our racial past has led to our racial present. So systemic racism and white supremacy are not merely found in the obvious or overt, as we talked about before. And judgments or actions on race are not necessarily conscious or intentional. That's another thing that colorblind ideology focuses on, right? This individual intentionality to not see race. But if you don't know the ways that racism and white supremacy might have influenced you, and you're not thinking about that because you're not thinking about race, then you're not able to address maybe some of those things that are on an individual level. So judgments or actions based on race, a lot of times we want to think about, well, I didn't mean to be racist, or well, it wasn't set up to be a racist system. And regardless of those things, one thing that I say is that we should focus on outcomes, focus on the results of things rather than our intentions. One thing that you might hear a lot about these days in terms of individual level racism is implicit bias. And there are lots and lots and lots of good bits of research on implicit bias. And what that means is that you may not realize the things that you are making judgments on based on race. And there are several reasons for that. One is that we are receiving all the time messages about race and racial inequality and racial difference and racial hierarchy. And if we spent every waking hour trying to fight against all those messages that we get, we still probably wouldn't be able to completely rid ourselves of the ways that that works into our psyche. The other thing is that we might have indirect ideas. So race is not only about people and thinking about people in terms of race, but thinking about things, parts of our culture, ways of behaving, right? And associating certain ways of behaving with certain types of people. And regardless of whether or not we think about it consciously, we might still have tendencies, right? Maybe not in an individual interaction, but over time, we might be able to see a pattern. So what implicit bias does is intend to sort of test these associations. The other thing that we have to think about is discrimination. And if we go back to that section on anti-racism, the first part of that section, I guess you would be this way, would be working on de jure types of racism or discrimination. So de jure means by law. So what we did was change laws and implement new laws to fix discrimination, to make discrimination illegal, to make racial equality in terms of voting, in terms of other things, legislate that, right? And when we have legislated something, we tend to think about, like, that's it. It's illegal. Like, you're not allowed to discriminate based on race. But that doesn't mean that in reality that people aren't discriminating, right? The discrimination isn't happening, right? We tend to think about, for example, segregation, right? When I say segregation, people think of, the Jim Crow era and enforced legal segregation. But segregation persists regardless of those laws, right? So there was segregation during that era that was legalized, but we have had for a good portion of time laws against segregation. And yet, if we look at just housing, just the housing market, you see tons and tons of discrimination, segregation, even in the North, right? So in places that, you would think maybe would have more equitable, sort of evenly distributed places of living, we still see that where people live is still very segregated, regardless of what the laws are. And someone might say, well, then people are just choosing. And I'm not going to say people don't choose to live with people who are like them, but we also have to think then about who has the choice, right? So often what it boils down to is white people choosing not to live in areas where people of color live. So we have to think about that. So when we say de facto, we don't just mean, de facto stands for a matter of fact. We don't just mean by choice, we mean just like as a matter of how things work out, right? The reality that exists. So then we move on to colorblind racism. So this is confusing for a lot of people because it's taking an ideology that purports to be anti-racist and saying, actually, this actually perpetuates racism. So how could so-called colorblindness be racist? How could it be racist not to see color? That sounds ridiculous. But if you have the working definitions of race and racism that we do in sociology and elsewhere, we can see that being colorblind doesn't necessarily solve the problem of racism as it's broadly defined. So refusing to see color or acknowledge race means defaulting to whiteness. Last time I talked about what whiteness is and what that means and why we should talk about whiteness. And one of the reasons is because in our culture in the United States, in the mainstream overall culture, we default to white ways of thinking, white ways of doing things, traits that we associate with white people. And we do this not just with race, but with other things too, class being one of them. So we tend to have a hierarchy of what is good and what is best, or, what is best. And it tends to be things that we associate with white people or white culture. White ways of dressing, white ways of wearing your hair. And I realize I'm saying the word white a lot, and that kind of freaks people out sometimes when we're focusing on whiteness. But all that is really turning that default around, because in order to understand what's happening with white supremacy, we have to focus on the ways in which we privilege whiteness. And one of those is just defaulting to whiteness and those things. Ignoring existing inequity and enabling racism. So I touched on that a little bit already. But if you are refusing to see race, or you think, why do we focus so much on race? Why do we talk about race? That's only going to make things worse. That actually allows us to turn literally colorblind, a blind eye to racism, and it enables it to exist, right? While we pretend that we aren't seeing race, and so everything's okay. And that's because we're applying an individual solution to a systemic problem. So one of the things that is an issue with being colorblind is that it focuses on individuals and says, well, if I don't see color, I'm not being racist, and I could teach other people not to be racist. And wouldn't that fix things? But when I talk about racism being a system, I mean that it goes beyond people and it goes beyond beliefs. So we have a system which which results in racial inequity, right? Regardless of whether or not someone was in there typing the button, typing, or, plotting and planning so that it would be racist, right? The outcomes that we see are unequal. And that's a problem. And that's regardless of whether somebody believed in racial inequality or believed in the value of white supremacy. Because I imagine that you would walk around and ask people, and they probably wouldn't say they support white supremacy. So turning to individuals and stopping at an individual level is really what the problem is. Because we have a system that's built on racism. Our economy is built on history of slavery that severely built in inequity and wealth, right? So we still have this huge amount of inequity in wealth, in opportunities, in all these other things in society that are built from that past. And in order to deal with those, we can't just change individuals' minds, because there is existing laws, there's ways of doing things, there's parts of our culture that are part of the problem, that aren't about individuals or a single individual. The other thing is it doesn't acknowledge or celebrate difference, right? If we don't see difference, if we want to treat everyone the same, then that means that we can't really celebrate all these wonderful ways that we're different. You know, there's lots of ways that our cultures are different, that we feel cause strife, but there's so many ways in which we have differences that are really valuable. And if we are ignoring our differences, then we are really just disregarding the value of our difference, right? And the sort of wonderful things that can come of difference, which also goes back to defaulting to whiteness. I want to talk really quick about colorblindness not addressing white supremacy or white privilege. So one of the things I have mentioned already is we live in a country where white equals neutral, where white equals normal, where white equals, you know, just the default. And because of that, we can't trust defaultness. Our ideas of neutrality or objectivity are all based around what it is to be white or to think in a white way. And when I say think in a white way, I don't say like based on your skin color, you think in a particular way. I mean, thinking in a way that is ingrained in the things that we are taught in sociology, the way we would say we are socialized, right? So we're socialized to believe certain things that we associate with white people tend to be more neutral, tend to be more objective. And so what I want to do right here is show about a 5-minute video clip that I think really brings out the ways that this happens in a system. And what we're going to see is reports of people who believe certain things, but it's also going to show us how we kind of trick ourselves into thinking we're being neutral, and that can actually not be necessarily the greatest thing. All right, so one of the reasons that I show that clip is that it shows a distinct example of trying to apply colorblindness to something that was identified as an issue of not addressing race. And then the solution was to have something invisible. And the reality is it was just part of the Band-Aid that was clear. That obviously has changed, and there are some Band-Aids that come in a variety of colors, but I would say still defaults to a certain skin tone. The other reason that I show that video is because it shows the ways in which our assumptions about people are shaped, right? We can say that we are not thinking in a racialized way, but sometimes when we purport to be neutral, we are actually making judgments. And it's a whole other layer of who do we see as neutral? What do we see as neutrality? And if we're not seeing color, we can purport that we're neutral when perhaps that's not what's going on. So here are just a couple of quotes that I pulled from Education Week Teacher, and a publication. So not seeing color also propagates a white-centric racial framework and perspective in which white privilege is maintained. So if you're not acknowledging race, then you're not acknowledging white privilege, or trying to work against it. Our racist systems continue to operate unchecked when white people like me act as though colorblindness is possible and desirable. So one thing with purporting colorblindness is you can kind of pat yourself on the back. I don't see color, right? You put yourself in this category that like you're exempt from the racism. But if you are taking a step back from that, you're also possibly allowing that to go on. So how does racism exist without racists? And this is part of this new racism that we have, right? So earlier I was talking about traditionally we see racists as these certain kinds of people with certain kinds of beliefs. And this book, Racism Without Racists, is a really great book on colorblind ideology, colorblind racism, and how that actually helps perpetuate and add to racism rather than eliminate it. So racism without racists. If racism is a system, it's bigger than individuals, right? So our working assumption is that racism is a system. If racism is a system, it's not merely about racist beliefs, right? Because it's beyond people's beliefs to our ways of interacting, our associations, our laws, our historical and economic systems. If racism is a system, it can exist regardless of anyone's intentions. So, you know, we've already talked about that a little bit, but you can intend positive things or non-racist things. But if we know that the system itself is racist in the outcomes, then our intentions really don't matter if the outcome is inequality. And if racism is a system, it can exist without the individual racists. So one thing with colorblind ideology is it assumes that if we went to sleep tonight and suddenly I could wave a magic wand and I was no longer, I had no racist beliefs whatsoever, and neither did anyone in the entire world. If we just flipped a switch and no one had racist beliefs anymore, colorblind ideology says racism would be gone, right? But if we have ways of doing things, if we have an unequal system already, and regardless of whether or not people are racist, we have segregation, we have incredible amounts of largely Black men, but also Black women who are imprisoned, very unequal proportion-wise, unequal schooling. There's so much inequality out there that even if we eliminated people's personal beliefs, even their implicit bias, racism and inequality along the lines of race would still exist. So we have to think about what is our end goal, right? And so that's what I want to steer us to right now. If we want to think about the end goal, first we have to have a clear assessment of where we are. And while we don't live in a system where slavery is legal, where segregation is legal, constitutionally, people are allowed to vote regardless of race, we still have a lot of inequality, right? And so we have to take a good look at that. We have to think about not just what's intended or who's believing what, but what are the outcomes, right? What are the realities? One thing that I have seen a lot in my years teaching about race is these really idealistic people who they have such good hearts and they want to believe that, you know, they don't see race or, you know, racial issues don't apply to them. And one of the things that happens is I have to work with people to be able to distinguish what you wish the world was like right? The world that you wish to be true and the actual world, right? So there's a distinction between those two things that's pretty important. And just thinking about the world that we want to have doesn't necessarily mean that it ends up that way. It's not bad to think about a world where there's not racial inequality, but to assume that that's what we have right now, not so great. So here is a series of comics that sort of try to focus on different possible end goals, right? So inequality is one of the possible end goals. So this would be probably most people what they would say, hey, I want there to not be inequality anymore, right? So if we can eliminate inequality, we have equal access to opportunities, right? And you'll see the little image there demonstrates that opportunities or apples are unequally distributed, right? So if we merely want to end inequality, then we make sure that people have equal access to opportunities, right? But again, like if we eliminated people's racist beliefs, if we even if we neutralized or eliminated all unequal opportunities as they currently stand, that does not eliminate the systems that are existing and the built-in inequality that exists in the United States. So what is the end goal? Equality, equity, justice. And I'm not saying that equality is a bad thing. I just don't think it's the end game. So where do we want to see us end up, right? And it makes sense that we might want to see equality. But if we understand that there's more than just the present, we might want to acknowledge the systems that are in place and try to change those. So there is equality and then there's equity. Equity is something that you have to acknowledge differences in order to achieve. So equality is just the rules are the same for everyone. Everyone should do fine. The rules are the same. Equity means that we acknowledge that there are already built-in inequalities and we try to make up for those. So this is the comic representing equality. So equally distributed tools and assistance, right? So there are tools there that are available. They're the same tools, the same rules, and yet things are not equal in the way that we would think about them being equal. People still don't necessarily have access to opportunities or resources in the way that some others do. So that's equality, and this image is meant to depict that difference, that even if we evenly distributed those things as they are, if the tree that represents the system or the current world, the state of things, is bent toward a particular direction, then the outcome is still that some people don't get an apple. And then we have justice. So this is the picture of what justice would look like, according to this metaphor that we're using. So justice is not only giving people equal resources, not only doing that, but fixing the system itself. So here we have made the tree stand up and people have equal reach to it. So this is the distinction we have here. So colorblind ideology, actually I'm missing equity. Oh, here's equity. Equity is giving someone a taller ladder. I don't know how these got it out of order, but I apologize for that. Equity is, okay, we acknowledge that there's a difference in the systems. We're gonna address the inequality, but it doesn't necessarily make the system itself more equal. It's giving people different tools. And this is where we'll hear a lot of things people will say about, giving people special privileges, right? And we know that the giving of certain things like affirmative action is to address the inequality that exists. But it still doesn't change the system. It's sort of like a half measure for addressing it. So if we look back here at justice, everybody can have the equal resources because the system is fixed, right? And I don't mean like fixed as in like rigged, but fixed as in like repaired. And to do that, we have to go to sort of the bottom of things. So let's go back here to modern conceptions of racism and anti-racism. So we have, just not enslaving people, low bar. Giving people technically the right to vote, and maybe then kind of the access to voting. Better. Anti-discrimination. Outlawing discrimination is definitely a good thing. But then the implementation of that is not necessarily something that we follow up on. Colorblindness, so not seeing color as the solution. That's sort of there in this individual level conception of racism. We have affirmative action, which represents this this equity framework, right? So building in ways that our society can account for and make up for the existing inequality. And then we have racial justice, which is creating a system that's not racist and not white supremacist. And you might say, but I'm only still one person. You're telling me we can't just, work on the individual level and change our beliefs and work on other people's beliefs. And you're telling me that's not enough, but I'm just a single person. And that's true, but individuals do influence how we address racism. And the conversations that we have about racism. And one thing that we can do is actually talk about this distinction between interpersonal, individual level racism and systemic racism. So seek to understand and honor lived experiences that are different from your own. So if people have different ways of doing things, don't assume that those are inherently wrong. Seek to celebrate and value differences without appropriating or tokenizing. I think what I would focus on here is really value, and not just by saying, oh, these two things are equal or equally good, but what is the value in something? So last time I showed a video on Ebonics, which is sometimes more currently referred to as African American Vernacular English. And a neutral position would say that's not English. And because it's not, the proper way of doing things, it's not valuable. But there's lots of things about African American Vernacular English, Ebonics, that are really valuable, unique, fascinating, like just in ways that, proper English is not, right? So tokenizing that would be to use or appropriate parts of Ebonics if you are a white person, or, lifting things about culture up on the one hand, without really thinking about the value that it holds. Challenge colorblind ideology and white supremacy. So, you'll hear people say, well, we just talk too much about race. Or if we didn't focus so much on racial inequality, we just wouldn't be so divided, and that would solve the problem. I really suggest that you try to challenge that when you hear people talk that way. You know, why is it that you don't want to look at that particular part of our society? If you close your eyes, does the world see? I mean, that could be a really philosophical question, but just because you turn away from something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist and that the problem's not still there. So we should not fault people for seeing color and seeing the disadvantages that really exist in society. You may say something like, well, because one problem that you'll see a lot is like, do you acknowledge someone's race when you're describing them? And I think that really depends on the context in which you're doing it. It's not inherently bad to refer to someone as being Black, but think about whether in that same situation you would refer to someone's race if they were white. Challenge yourself on that and focus on changing the system, not just individuals. Do that with your vote, with the policies that you support. There's lots of different ways to focus on the system. And now, questions.
Great, thanks so much, Michaela. There are some questions, and I'm going to be checking chat and Q&A. I don't know. I'll read some of these. I don't know that you're going to have definitive answers, but why are some white people racist and afraid of Black people when Black people were the ones who were enslaved?
That's a great
thoughts
question
about that.
It's just like, right, that blows your mind. Like, how could that be the case? And I would say that white supremacy really built in that fear. Fear of the other, fear of people who are non-white, and so much of people's complicity, people's willingness to believe racist things is built on that fear. And it's also a form of gaslighting. So gaslighting is a term that kind of gets thrown around, but it's what I would call cultural gaslighting. So the reality that exists is there's been this incredible harm done to Black people, to non-whites, and the likelihood is that, it's going to be either someone who is, let me back up. So that harm exists, right? But so much of the foundations of racism are built on getting white people to be afraid. And so that's not something that is going to be easy to undo, unfortunately. It's ridiculous. It's very contradictory to fact and reality. But that's part of why it has such a strong hold on people, because it's really, really built into the ways that we have experienced history and culture. So if we look just at immigration, for example, one of the things about immigration is this idea of fear of the other. And invoking that fear gets people to do things that they might not otherwise. Or fear of how a certain group is supposedly behaves has historically been a way to justify harm against that group. So I don't necessarily know that I have an answer, except for it's built into our entire culture. Yeah.
Okay.
And the other thing that I will say about that is, particularly white women are seen as vulnerable, and have used their white women, their sort of understanding of white women to their advantage in that way. And what I mean by that is, understanding white women as frail and as victims, and as threatened by people of color, particularly men of color.
Okay. Here is another question. It's a big question, but your thoughts about getting police departments to have diversity, sensitivity training, more diverse police departments, and ending racial profiling, police brutality, and why are so many white police officers acquitted after murdering a Black person?
Woo, that's a lot.
Yeah. So police in general, I guess, and diversity, and yeah.
So I'll touch on two things. One thing that is happening is, it's not about diversity per se, but it's about use of force. So one thing that Surge, showing up for racial justice, as well as other groups throughout the United States, are doing is reviewing use of force policies of different departments, and then keeping an eye on whether they are following those use of force policies. Because where we tend to see use of force abused is, unfortunately, along racial lines, along the lines of the disabled folk, people who are disabled, and LGBT folks as well. So if we are going to try to enforce some people to stick to their own policies, because there's increasing pressure for them to have policies that regulate their use of force. We have to also then follow up on that and make sure that that's something they're sticking to, or they feel that they need to stick to it because someone is watching them. So that's one way that I know of, that people are working toward more equal policing systems as they exist. What was the end of that question?
Why do so many white police officers get off so easily after they murder a Black person?
Okay. I mean, I think there's a lot. One, I think there's a lot of implicit bias, and I think we are still struggling with this idea that we don't want to label a police officer racist. And again, if it was about their personal beliefs, then we could talk about whether or not they're a racist, but it's about the outcome, right? If the outcome is unequal, then it's a problem. If the outcome is that more Black people die, it's a problem. And because of that, there's this defense that happens along the lines of race, and the idea is, if we're holding people accountable, then we're calling them racist, as if the worst thing in the world could be to call them racist and not allow people to die. But so I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that our society is built around a certain ideas about policing, and how police maintain law and order and those sorts of things. And so I think there are lots of folks who think that if we criticize the police, or if we say that a police person did anything wrong, then we are undermining the system of law and order, which I disagree with. But I think that allows us, Like, I think there are a lot of people who are, you know, sort of making these decisions, whether consciously or not, are weighing that, right? And that they feel that this idea of maintaining our current police system outweighs the terrible results. I mean, that's one thing that I would look to in solving and in looking for that answer.
Great. Just a couple comments here. One, that Crayola has a new box of crayons, colors of the world. Each color represents everyone in terms of skin tone. So interesting. Thank you for that. Another comment, is it fear of revenge? Maybe this is referring to why are white people so afraid of Black people? Fear of revenge, perhaps, for poor treatment. Let's see. Another comment that, excuse me, this is a great platform to address racism. People have strong beliefs, I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
which determine the building blocks for systemic racism. How will that ever change from an individual perspective?
We have to see race, and we think of we have to acknowledge the ways in which we perpetuate racism in order to change those things about ourselves. So one of the things I think that we have to do is be willing to be wrong, be willing to accept that we were wrong, be willing to value the voices of people of color, and maybe sometimes give those special consideration, considering the imbalances that we have. And I think part of the reason that, you know, we advocate against colorblindness is so that we can acknowledge those underlying problems, whether they're active beliefs or whether they're the associations. Because if you don't realize that you have built in, you know, racist and white supremacist associations, if you don't realize a history where, for example, gynecology is built on racism, like there are racist roots to almost everything in our society, and we can't know every single thing, but we can realize that those things exist and that those things have influenced how we see the world. And then we can go from there and challenge those things as we go. We can expand how we see the world. And I think that's no small task.
Great, thanks. Let's see here. Just a comment, question about all the protesting, the looting and violence that sometimes has come from that. And why are people so angry now? This is the comments question. Maybe you can address that. What's going on right now?
I mean, I think the difference is that more white people are angry. I think there's definitely an increase in people of color protesting, but the fact that more white people are willing to participate, to get angry about an experience that doesn't necessarily have negative consequences for them in the same way. That that allows for some momentum. And I'm certainly not saying like, oh, let's cheer on white people for the Black Lives Matter movement. I hope that's not the way it's coming across. What I'm saying is that I don't think the anger is new. I think the anger is now being expressed, right? And it's more visible than it was. And white people could hide from it. So if we're segregated, if we're living in a segregated world, and not just where we live, but our workplaces are often really segregated. If we're not being exposed as white people to those viewpoints, then we don't, why would we be angry about it if we don't even have any awareness, right? So I think there's an increased level of awareness, and lots of visible things that it has, like the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements have made it harder for white people to look away. And I think that the anger is more visible, not necessarily new or increasing.
Okay, great. This is kind of a long comment and question. What are some of the best facts to use to show the most challenging aspects of being Black in America? Because I understand Black families lost tremendously more in household equity than white folks in the last recession. But if I say Black families have 10% or less, or I think it's actually more or less than white families, I get responses that Blacks are less responsible. They bought too much house and their greed made them lose. They went upside down on their mortgage, which was dumb, etc. Or that the reason so many Blacks are disproportionately in prison is because they just are inherently lawless, criminal, etc. These systemic issues are so entrenched. How do you quickly ask questions that get this stuff for people who don't read or care about it? So when you're sharing and people have other explanations besides racism, do you have any suggestions in talking with people?
Well, I think there are some different avenues. I think I'll take something from a friend of mine, and who recently encountered some responses like these. And what she told people was, you realize the beliefs that you just espoused about Black people being more criminal is the definition of white supremacy. It's the definition of racist beliefs. And it's and not necessarily saying, hey, you're racist, but like, wait a minute, do you realize what you're saying here? When you say this thing, you know, you think that, you know, you're shifting blame, but what you're doing is reproducing racist ideas. And, you know, if it's somebody that you care about, like, why do you want to do that? And, you know, do you and on what basis are you grounding this idea in, right? So that would be one thing. We don't always want to challenge people, and we're not always in a place to challenge people in that way. So there are probably more diplomatic ways of pointing out the faultiness in those beliefs. And one place we might start is challenging why people have those beliefs. So one way to engage with people that tends to be more productive is to ask people questions, to be genuinely curious, right? Which can be really hard if people are just being blatantly racist or, you know, not really trying to engage with you. But one way to deal to engage is to ask people questions and really have a curiosity. Like, where does that belief come from? So what makes you think this? And not like, what makes you think that, but like, like, how could you have come to this conclusion? I don't come to that conclusion. And that's also another approach that's not for everybody in every moment. But especially if you're a white person, you have a little bit more privilege to engage in conversations like that. And that's one way to get people to think about their positions without necessarily just going in and attacking them.
And I have to say, I think that is really great advice. I mean, doing conversations at the library and focusing on bringing people together who have different ideas and beliefs. A lot of it comes down to just being curious and listening to other people and just trying to find out more about why they think that. So,
and really quickly, I mean, there are lots of sort of touchstones that you could go on for addressing some of the most serious systemic problems of racism. But I do think that one thing you can do is try to move people away from individual conversations. So it's a video that I'm probably going to show in the next section of the series. But there is a video by a guy named Jay Smooth called How to Tell Someone They Sound Racist. And the point of the entire video is that he doesn't care if someone sounded racist. If what you did was racist, then hey, don't do that. So he has a lot of like good ideas about reorganizing the conversation so it's not about individuals, because when people come back and say, well, there is choice, and these people are choosing to be this way, that not only focuses on individuals, it assumes that people have equal choices, which is, again, not necessarily the case.
Here's a question. Are you familiar with Project Implicit? And what do you think of Project Implicit as a tool for identifying your own personal bias?
I think I know. I'm going to Google it because I just want to make sure it's the thing I'm thinking of. Yeah, the Harvard thing. So Project Implicit is, you can actually go on the website and take implicit bias tests. And through that, they're gathering all this data on implicit bias, but they're also trying to raise awareness of people's implicit bias. I think it's a good project. I think we're finding there are things to consider when you're talking about implicit bias. But I think a lot of the critiques that we do see that are popping up of those they just really don't have an understanding of how like implicit biases work. They kind of assume that the people talking about implicit bias are biased. So again, it's like that talking about racism is racist. So I would say that I think that it's a good starting point. So as an individual, if you took an implicit bias test, that could give you some things to think about, and some ways of thinking, maybe I make some associations that I didn't realize that I make. But regardless of how you like where you end up, if you take an implicit bias test, it's still good to be thinking about those things. So yeah, I would encourage people to take an implicit bias test. Then you can kind of see how it works. but definitely don't stop there, or definitely don't like take that test and think, oh, well, they're saying I'm racist and I can't be racist. If you're going to take the test, really take the time to consider what it might mean.
Thanks. Have you read or heard about, I'm sure probably you have heard about, but have you read Cast by Isabel Wilkerson?
I've
She
heard
has
of it, but
that new book out. Okay.
I have
And
not
so
read
we
it.
have a comment that it's very good.
Okay.
So some of you might be interested in reading that. And let's see, I think it is 8:20, so we're past our close time. I think we've answered most of the questions. If anyone else has any questions or would like to get in touch with Dr. Null, I am going to put my email address in the chat, and I'll if Michaela wants to put hers in, she can, or if you can also just send email questions to me and I can forward them to her. And
you are going to post the link to the PowerPoint.
Yes,
like
yes, to the PowerPoint. I will do that. Yes. So if you go to, it's going to take me a few days to just edit this video. But we will post it at rightlibrary.org/anti-racism along with the slides. And I think I don't have the slides from last time posted, but I think you did send them to me. So I'll try to get those up too. Please let me know if you have any questions. And the next session talking about white supremacy in January is the registration for that is open. So again, if you visit rightlibrary.org/anti-racism 101, you'll be able to register for that too. And thanks for coming tonight. Thank you so much, Michaela.
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
I just have since we were talking about books, I just thought of a book suggestion. I haven't read it yet, but I have it recommended by several different people about the book. And I think it would be a good place to start if someone wanted to start thinking about sort of the insidiousness of white supremacy and how it's built into the way we live our lives today. It's called Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans. And so it goes back through colonial times and links it to the things that are happening now. So a book like that would be good for linking the past to the present.
Okay. And you did mention a reading list too, that maybe we can add to also that page. So
yes,
we'll try
I have
to
a couple of links as well.
So we'll get that up in the next few days, hopefully. Thanks again for everybody for coming. Thank you, Michaela, and hopefully we'll see y'all in January.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.